Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and we're going to be reading today The Eternal Bones and the Good Heart, a short story I wrote this week. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, we are on Facebook and Twitter. Or also, this is the recorded audio and visual version of the show that's going to be put up on iTunes. I will then take the audio portion, clean it up a bit, and it will go out as a podcast, and that is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other places, as well as you can listen to it directly on CryptoBiography.com. And here we go. The Eternal Bones and the Good Heart. Lloyd Jameson met Anne Rosemont through his work. He was a baker. He'd always been a baker from when he was a small child. His mother had taught him about how dough could rise and become bread or cakes or other things, and he had simply become entranced. Though he put himself through college, he was already starting out on his baking career, providing rolls, cakes, and other delights for caterers. He could work around their schedules, making large batches in very short order, and it left time for him to get classes and homework done as well. He's very proud of the fact that, though he took a business major for practical reasons, he did not back down on his other courses. Instead of poetry for business majors, he took a full English Lit minor and took difficult courses in math and other subjects that went well beyond the minimums needed for him to graduate, and he did so with excellent grades. After college, he buried himself in his work. He quickly got a reputation in his city for making the best pastries, breads, and other baked goods. He was so successful that he sold out his inventory nearly every day. Because of this, he made a lot of money and expanded into a breakfast and lunch menu, and soon his business had a good number of employees and an enthusiastic clientele. He worked both in the kitchens and up front, visiting the customers and helping fill their orders. He made sure to hire people he felt had good character. Everything else, in his opinion, could be taught. Even the recipes for his precious breads and pastries could be taught if the person had a good heart, and that was the name of his shop, the Good Heart Bakery. The schedule allowed him a few hours to himself in the evenings, but otherwise he was very busy, needing to go in well before the early opening to get the doughs made and kneaded and everything put into the oven at the right time and temperature. He knew he would not be able to work the whole day if he kept it open for a dinner crowd, so he closed mid-afternoon. But the bakery is so busy that it made him, over the course of time, a good amount of money. He didn't date much. He had a few fun times in high school, though nothing ever very serious. And once he buried himself in college and his bakery, he simply didn't seem to have time or energy to date. But sometimes dating will come to you. One afternoon, when he and his crew were getting ready to close up, a woman came in and simply changed his life. It was one of those rare moments in life where one can't recall the details properly. All he could remember is that she introduced herself as Anne Rosemont. He got the feeling that she had been a number of times recently, and though her face was etched into his mind from that moment on, he hadn't really noticed her before. They chatted while he worked. He knew she must have been quite a bit younger than him by then. He was now in his 30s, and she could not have been older than 25. He somehow knew she was interested in him, and he was interested in her. Without either of them really asking, they arranged for a date that very night, and she was in his life. As much as he adored her, it took some adjustment for him to bring her into his life. His bakery was still his passion. But now his evenings were no longer mere time markers, short moments to take a breather, but something to look forward to in their own right. Those evenings where he couldn't see her somehow started to feel empty. They were missing something. He was exhausted, but he was happy. One day, thinking back on how they'd met, he realized he'd never known what had attracted her to him, for surely that was what had happened. "Lloyd," she said over the dinner he had made of roast pork loin and potatoes with artichokes and gravy, "I came into your shop a few weeks before we talked that day." She took a moment, and he realized he was just gazing, as he often did, into her clear brown eyes, as though they were a warm bed on a cold night. "You were talking to someone, and I couldn't tell if you were talking to a first-time customer or someone who had been in the Good Heart for years. I have a good ear for such things, and that grabbed my interest. Then you said something to her in jest. 'For the nourishment of one living being, I would make peace with all.' You didn't bring any attention to the fact that it was from Mary Shelley, or that it was a quote at all. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed a few similar little references, always subtle, never called out by you or the one who you made it to. I just realized you had something I liked. Lloyd could only grin. Is this where you start talking about your past, where you learned all that? Because I learned it from college, but you love to change the subject whenever I bring up anything from your growing up. It was true. He knew Anne worked for several charities, but she hadn't told him about her growing up. My parents died years ago. I was young, inherited a good amount of money. I was fortunate. A family friend helped me put it mostly into stocks for the long term, and I've never had to worry about money since. So I work at charities. I never did attend college, but I've been an avid reader since I was a child. I happen to love a lot of older books. There's no way to know for sure, but I think I could hold my own against any literature major. I believe it. Regardless of subject, you're the brightest woman I've ever met, Lloyd said, and meant it, though he smiled wryly, knowing it might sound like flattery. But she smiled back brightly. The best part is you mean it, she said. Yeah, Lloyd said, no longer able to meet her gaze, but he still smiled. And though he never doubted her love for him, he was often surprised by her. She was indeed a voracious reader. Her house was stuffed with books in every corner, and none were for decoration. Because of this, she had the same worldly view of anyone who had gone through college and even experienced some of life. She clearly had been affected, he thought, by the loss of her parents early on. She often mentioned knowing things on a wide array of topics, and, like him, could quote many famous works. He soon realized that, though she never made it obvious, she was likely the most intelligent and well-educated person he'd ever known. That she had become so in some 12 fewer years than he had lived impressed him even more. Being with her was a joy and an inspiration to him. Coming into her arms in the evening was his coming home. When, inevitably, he proposed marriage, she told him, I love you, Lloyd, but my situation's unusual. I can't mix my finances up with anyone. It wouldn't work. He offered a prenup, but she just shook her head and smiled and took his face in her hands. I can't share that with you, but I want to be with you as long as I can. He wasn't sure what she meant exactly. It was another moment that she had surprised him, but he agreed. And though they were never wed, from that moment, he felt as though he were married to Anne. It was never talked about again, and he never asked her again. He simply acted as if she were his wife, and to him, she acted as though he were her husband. He noted that, though she was never ostentatious, she always bought the highest quality in everything, which tended to last and also to look high quality for almost all its life. So her clothes were timeless and fit her impeccably, her furniture was sumptuous and never went out of fashion, and she always bought high-quality foods, which, when he wasn't preparing them himself, she made into delicious classic meals. And they were happy. He realized over time that the money she had must be much more than she was letting on, but he didn't care, and he tried never to show that he knew. They split most of their costs down the middle, and he simply did his best to ignore the money side of things. Her charity work took her away sometimes, but he could always throw himself further into the bakery. During those times, part of him wondered if she would find someone else, someone better, younger, smarter, whatever. He couldn't put his finger on why this was. He'd never felt insecure about himself before. He had, from a rational point of view that he had to remind himself of. No reason to feel this way, but he did every time she left. And every time she returned, the feeling vanished, and he wondered why he had felt that way at all. The years passed, and he approached his 40s as she approached her 30s. He envied her youth, for he was starting to gray around his temples, and his hairline was starting to recede. Well, she looked the same. But she assured him that she loved the way he looked, and indeed his maturity was one of the things she loved most about him. And then he was 45, and looked it. The bakery was still doing well, propelled along by his vigor and his love. He had some wrinkles around his eyes and a strange spot on his leg that his doctor checked out and assured him was normal, but was not going to go away either. Meanwhile, Anne looked the same as ever, though she worked as hard as he did. He often went to the charity functions that she helped plan, and knew that the rest of her day was often filled with meetings and preparation to gather money for her causes, which invariably revolved around children. He was a little sad whenever he thought on this, because she had told him that she could not have children, yet she clearly loved them. He suggested that they could perhaps adopt. But she just smiled and said, I'm sorry, my love, but I can't do that. I just can't. She wouldn't say any more on the subject. But despite having no children of her own, she adored the kids that her charities helped. As he approached 50, he lost more of his hair, but his energy was still good. Anne, however, looked exactly the same. It happened one night over dinner. I don't know how you do it, he said. She'd been taking a bite of the excellent chicken and white wine and mushroom sauce she had made. She looked at him, smiling at her as she finished her bite, then asked, "Do what?" "Look the same now as you did when we met." She immediately started to cry. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," he said, not knowing what he should be sorry for. "I'm sorry. What did I do?" She shook her head, hair covering her face. She just held her hand up, indicating she needed a moment. He remained silent. Finally, she composed herself, partly, and she pulled her hair back over her ears and looked at him, studying him. "I knew the day would come. Part of me still hoped it never would. I hoped you would pretend." He had no idea what she was getting at. Pretend? Pretend it was all normal. Her face tightened up, but she didn't cry anymore. Pretend it wasn't happening. Just live our lives. It's not fair that I hoped it, but I did, so help me, I did. Anne? I don't know how it happened, so don't ask me. I was scared of dying of old age, just like everyone else, maybe more. One day I realized I wasn't aging. My body had become an adult body, but then I just kept there. That was a long time ago. I had a husband by then, of course. This was when that was the norm. He aged, and I didn't. Soon people started to talk. Ugly words swirled around: witch, magic, demon. They wouldn't have believed me if I'd told them that even I didn't know what was going on. So I left. I left without saying a word to my husband, who'd been kind to me and loved me. I had loved him, too. But I didn't know what to say. I moved to America. It was a land where everything was new, where there were new cities popping up all over. No one had any history or memory. I moved every few decades. I watched as my last family died overseas, learning it only by searching newspaper records. I watched as friends I made aged and died, many of them starting to wonder how I stayed so young. Strange. As afraid as I was of growing old and dying, now I would welcome it. Something about my body keeps me young, but apparently it also keeps me from having children. And I can't get cancer or other diseases, or surely I would have had them by now. I don't care if you stay young. If you're okay with me getting old, I still love you. I would love that, Lloyd. I really would. And if we were on an island somewhere, we could do that. But something I've learned is that the people I'm closest to are the last to notice my unusual nature. If you're bringing it up, then others are already noticing. You see me every day. The lack of change is hidden. There are, I promise you, already people shocked by my appearance. A distant part of him was shocked at how readily he was accepting all this. But it answered everything that had been unusual about her from their first meeting. Then maybe we go off together, make a new life for ourselves, somewhere else. She shook her head. I couldn't make you give up your bakery, she said, and I've been selfish enough. I want so badly to have a normal life with someone that I could never tell you. But I'll have to move on, find another life somewhere, and start over. Now tears were welling in his eyes. I can't believe this is it, that it's over just like that you're going to leave. I have to. I would have stayed with you if you told me. I could have found a way to make it work. Would you have believed me? I hardly believe it myself, and I live it every day, every year, every decade. How could I have told you early on? At best, you would have put it down as an odd affect of mine and not really believed it until a decade or two had passed. And we would have ended up here anyway. Losing you hurts too much, especially since it isn't either of our faults. I know, my love. It hurts me too. And I won't ever see you again? I can't promise you will. And though he knew it wouldn't help, he got up from the table, came around to her, and held her close. He couldn't see from the tears in his eyes, and he didn't know how long he held her like that. He only remembered later with the house quiet and her gone. She got her things when he was at the bakery a few days later, and that was that. The bakery was all that kept him together. It gave him a place to be, a place to go, people to talk to pretend to be normal, to fake like life was all right. The nights were the hard part. He had a breakdown a few weeks later. His body gave in to a regular cold as though it were the plague, and he was sick for weeks. There wasn't anything his doctor could do, though he understood immediately once he told him about Anne leaving him. "You'll be all right eventually," he told Lloyd. "Do you have any thoughts of harming yourself?" He hadn't. Lloyd stayed in bed, and it was fortunate that his bakery had such good employees and a good reputation, because many small businesses might have had real trouble. Once he came back, though, it didn't take long for things to be back to normal. For the good heart, if not for Lloyd. He went to a charity function, one of Anne's. She wasn't there. He found someone he recognized and chatted her up, though he couldn't remember her name. She worked for the charity, too, and was sad about Anne having left suddenly a few weeks back. He made a sizable donation, but never went to another function. The years went on, and eventually he found another love. It wasn't a substitute, it was just different. He had great affection for her. They married, and though it was too late to have kids, she had a couple of teenagers from her first marriage, and he was pleased at how nice it was to be a family with all of them. Eventually, he retired, selling the bakery to one of his employees, and his wife retired with them. They traveled the world. They colored a map in with a marker, and eventually the map was more marked than unmarked. He always kept his eye open, looking for something. He pretended not to know what it was that he hoped to see. Years later, his wife got cancer. They had a long goodbye as she lost her strength, her hair, and eventually her life. He scattered her ashes along dozens of the beaches and cities and vistas that they had previously visited, all of her favorites. He did only a pinch at each place and kept traveling. It was on the southern coast of France near Cannes that he got to the final pinch of his wife's ashes. He had saved it for here. It was the first place overseas that they had traveled, and it had been very special for both of them. He took out the small plastic bag it had traveled in and reached into it, taking the blue-gray ashes in his fingers and lifting them up and over the railing he was leaning on, over the wine-dark Mediterranean. He released the ashes and watched them swirl away, quickly being lost in the shadow of the cliff. Watched until there was nothing left to watch but the sea rolling below him and continuing off to the horizon. And then he went home. He wasn't sure what to do with his life. Retired and now finished with his personal quest to spread his wife's ashes, he didn't have any other plans. More years passed, and he had to put himself into a nursing home. Time moved very strangely there. It seemed to drag on most of the time, and yet sometimes he would wake up and realize a year had passed. Every day was a lot like the others. He tried to keep engaged in life. He taught the people in the home's kitchen how to make some of his famous breads. It made him smile to see everyone enjoying them again. One day after lunch, having eaten a sandwich made on one of his ciabatta rolls, he went back to his room. He decided to do a bit of reading. But he wasn't. He was just looking out the window at the small but well-maintained garden the home had back there. He didn't know any of the flowers or plants' names, and he was thinking about that fact. Lloyd? He hadn't even turned around before he knew who it was. Anne? She stood there, unchanged, lovely, in a flowing dress made of silk. She might have just left him the night before. He couldn't stop the tears from coming. He stood there, feeling stupid, feeling old, feeling weak, but also feeling in him something he couldn't name but was circling his chest on golden wings. "You look lovely." "Thank you. You look handsome." Lloyd gave a single grunt. "I look what I am. Old." "Yes, but handsome. We can't all look our age." "Truer words," Lloyd said, not bothering to finish the phrase. "How long can you stay?" "Just a while," she said, smiling, and he could see she was close to breaking herself. "How are you?" he asked. "The same," she said. "I did a little checking. You've had a good life." "I suppose so," Lloyd said. "That time we had together, it started to feel like a dream. I think part of me had to tear away from it, pretend it wasn't real, so that I couldn't hope that you might come back. I think that would have broken me." She just nodded. "Have you—" he started, then stopped. "No, I don't really want to know. But I want the best for you. I want you to be happy again, with someone I mean," he added, then finished, "if that's what you want." "Thanks," she said. She hadn't moved since he had turned around. She was still near the door. "You deserve it," he said. She didn't say anything to that. "It was strange afterward," he said, "all those years together, and yet I had to sort of pretend they didn't happen. It was like a big stretch of my life had a hood over it." Remember when we went to San Francisco and there was a huge pod of whales just offshore? She nodded. So many things are coming back to me now. I wasn't letting myself remember, but they're all there. And you're the only one I guess I can really talk with them about. But we don't have that kind of time, she said. I know, but maybe it's enough to remember, he said. And now I can. Thank you. She stepped forward and he held out his arms. They embraced, and she held her head against his chest. She felt and smelled exactly as he remembered. He was embarrassed by his paper-thin skin, by the hair that was almost completely gone now, by his chest muscles wasted away that she surely could feel under his cheek, hiding just above the eternal bones and what he hoped was his good heart. Goodbye, my love, he whispered. Goodbye, she said. I envy you. And there we have it. I enjoyed writing that story a lot. Touches on a lot of important themes for me, so I hope you liked it too. If you have comments and questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter, and we'll see you next week. Words and music, copyright 2018, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved.